Yet another giant gun. Why did they do this? It was bad enough they did it the first time I was here, now they did it again. Only a lot worse this time. A lot worse. Apparently, it needs to be a galactic law to never, ever leave a human engineer alone for too great a period of time. Especially when they have access to a great quantity of resources. Apparently, they also learned from the mistakes of their last attempt and made it so this one can actually do its job. Effectively. Which by itself is both terrifying and also inspiring. No, I take that back. It's just fucking terrifying. I often wonder why the gods created humanity. Was it to test us? Was it to laugh at us? Since I started this commission, I often find myself conflicted with a multitude of emotions. Fear, anger, annoyance, irritation, awe, shock, amazement. I feel all this all the time, every time I deal with these insane apes. I am both thankful a species with such incredible capability is our ally, and infuriated that this is what they do with that capability. I looked at the Navy Admiral next to me. He was just as done as I was this time. Guys, you can't tell me you seriously have this much extra crap to spare to build these, he said, still holding his head in his hands. Well, yeah, we do. You'd be surprised what you can do with a huge scrapyard. Besides, it's hand-me-down mats from derelicts and ancient ships. It isn't like we're spending billions of credits for it, one of the engineers proudly said, still holding a wrench. But that doesn't mean, you know what? Screw it. Is this one actually practical? Especially at this size. And why 2 of them? He asked. Yes it is, and... Because reasons. The engineer replied with a smirk. Care to elaborate on those reasons? I asked, finally breaking from my momentary despair. Because... reasons... He replied sheepishly and backed away. The Admiral looked at me. So, you want the first shot, or should I? He said as he held up the big red button. I sighed, rolled my eyes, and pressed the big red button. I pressed it for 3 seconds, and it let out a sequence of 5 ridiculously rapid bursts, each burst firing 10 of its 7.92-inch shells. The side of the gun had a belt of several thousand of the damn things that the gun greedily sucked up. A massive pit nearby, dug almost a half-mile deep, caught every shell that it expended, each one hitting the ground with a hollow clang. The gun itself let off a sound that was more a deafening, constant roar of fire rather than the singular explosions and massive booms of the first one they built. The firing platform they built almost perfectly absorbed the recoil the gun had, a combination of both its giant bipod stabilizing it and a massive mechanism holding it firmly in place. It was a machine gun from back in the day. Apparently a gun that was responsible for the most casualties in a single battle. Now I understand why. The atmosphere warped and twisted as the gun fired its shells, the shock waves from the barrel making the atmosphere angrily twist and swirl around it. I pressed the button solid for 20 seconds. It fired full auto this time, letting out a massive blast of its shells. Too many, too fast to even count. 20 seconds of deafening, merciless fire. By the time it stopped firing, the pit for the shell casings was half full. One of the engineers approached us and smiled. Cool, huh? MG-42, Hitler's buzzsaw, he said with a smirk. Well, yeah. How often does the mechanism and barrel need to be replaced with this one? I asked, aware my ears were now ringing ever so slightly. Never. Can handle a full 2,000-round full auto fire. We have a slightly more sophisticated and less flashy way of working with this one. Simple load and fire, usually box mag, sometimes the belts get stuck. Can pretty much use it anywhere we need to. The barrel and majority of the assembly is made of nanocarbon, which is Starship material, which means this thing can handle almost anything. And check this out, he said, and stepped back. He depressed some levers and set some switches on a control panel. The entire assembly moved up by about 20 feet. The platform holding the gun swiveled left 20 degrees, then moved up, aiming almost completely upwards. This one can actually be used for planetary defense, unlike the Garand we built. This one can actually fire at ships, and we actually tested it on a Telestaran dreadnought, he said with a sly smirk. I snapped my neck to look at him so hard I swear I broke something. You what? Myself and the Admiral both said at once. He simply chuckled and pressed a button. A television screen appeared out of the platform and played a video. While the humans were busy calibrating their giant gun, a Telestaran dreadnought, one of the largest and most heavily armed warships of the 12 races, appeared and attempted to take the star system. They didn't get very far as the gun fired a full burst of 700 rounds in quick succession, a veritable beam of solid projectiles coming from the planet's surface. Any ship of any kind would fail under those conditions. I watched in terrified awe as the dreadnought started being pelted by a stream of hundreds of projectiles. The shields failed, and the armor was now denting, paint scratching, and turrets being blown apart by explosive shell impacts. The television also allowed audio, and I cradled my head in my hands at the sounds of the crew panicking, believing they were under attack by a massive fleet. When the stream of bullets finally stopped, the dreadnought was held together by wishes and good vibes, barely functioning as the ship captain opened his comms and begged surrender. We were going to just turn it into Swiss cheese, but we, kinda ran out of ammo. That was the first firing test. It did pretty good, but we fixed a few errors and made it better, the engineer said, smirking. Crazy damned humans, a gravelly voice nearby said. The Admiral and I looked to our right, now noticing the Telestaran Admiral Kohokuru flanked by 2 legionnaires, his 4 hands in cuffs. Kohokuru, God. This is embarrassing, I said to him with a definite smirk. Gods above, please tell me they didn't do anything more than this. I don't think the galaxy can stand it, I yelled out in frustration. So, does that mean you don't want to see the 8-inch GAU-80 CIWS we built then? Another giant gun. They built a giant gun. Again. But no, this was different. Not like the other giant gun they built, or that other giant gun they built that other time. No. This was an actual giant gun. I stood on the concrete slab supporting the strange contraption, this one sitting on a human garden world. I held my head in my hands as they proudly stood in front of me with smiles on their faces. Why? I asked simply. Why not? Came the simple response, and I was led on a tour. Under most circumstances, we would simply be inspecting the planet's defenses, making sure they simply were up to code and couldn't shatter a planet accidentally 10,000 years from now, to make sure their targeting systems would not miss, to make sure they couldn't cause any severe collateral damage. Humans were a different breed of beast. They made absolutely sure that every single gun could shatter a star in half and never miss. This was nothing but stupid, even for humans. This was a dumb concept, a dumb execution, just plain fucking dumb. I was shown around the structure, and they pointed at the stock of the giant gun. I simply looked at him and asked why. He simply smiled and said, why not? He showed me the giant mechanical arm they crafted out of a Starship factory assembly mechanism. He showed me how it pulled the giant gun's trigger and performed various loading actions, including a demonstration of how it was used to remove a jam. I looked at him and asked him why. He smiled and simply said, why not? He showed me the way the barrel was made and how the barrel had to be replaced after so many shells were fired. He told me the shells it fired were 30-inch high explosive shells. He showed me the firing mechanism and explained how it worked. I looked at him and asked him why. He simply smiled and said, why not? He then showed me the loading mechanism, an obscenely complicated, gigantic mechanical arm mimicking the movements of a human arm as they demonstrated the way the gun was loaded. A giant clip of ammunition weighing hundreds of tons is lifted a quarter-mile off the ground and slid into a chamber on top of the gun. The bullets are then pushed down by the giant mechanical finger, and the weapon is loaded as the 3-ton clip is discarded to the left. I looked at him and asked, "We?" He simply looked at me and said, "Why not?" He then handed me the button to fire with a smile. "If you tell me you don't want to see this thing fire, I will look you in your eyes and call you a liar." I sighed. I once again asked why, only to receive a smile as I pushed the button. The giant gun fired, and the massive amount of recoil from the 30-inch shell made the whole platform shudder, and the gun moved back about 30 feet before the catching mechanism forced it forward again. In quick succession, the gun fired 7 more shells, the process repeating to the happy sounds of every human in the area squealing with delight. The last shell fired let out a sudden loud metallic noise like a giant sword being hit by a giant tuning fork. The empty casings from the shells blasted out the right side and dented the ground they landed on, pooling in a huge hole in the ground where a massive 60-ton crane was waiting to collect them. I looked at him and asked him why. He simply smiled back and said, "Why not?" at an annoyingly loud volume. I watched with morbid fascination as the enormous monstrosity was loaded again with the giant mechanical arm. I held my head in my hands, out of sheer despair at this point, as I looked at the amount of shells that were ready to fire. I heard a human voice appear behind me. "What the hell's going on here?" It was the human admiral, the commander of the military garrison in charge of the sector. He took one look at the weapon in front of him and held his head in his hands as well. He stayed there for a few moments and let out a silly, annoyed chuckle. Did you seriously build a giant 30-inch M1 Garand?" he asked them as he looked at me. "Yup!" They all smiled at him as if they genuinely accomplished something important. He stood beside me as I slowly lowered my head. I looked at him, disappointed. I sighed and officially gave up, slowly raising my hand to let him have a turn with the big red button. Like an excited child, he pressed it, and the weapon went through its firing sequence, ending with a grand and glorious ping. Once again, the assembled crowd cheered with glee, letting out a might "Ura" as the gun pinged. One final time, I asked them why. They simply responded, "Why not?"